So this is a second part of a video series I'm doing on a customer's problematic SIG 320. I recommend watching the first video in where I attempt to diagnose problems in its fire control unit or FCU. In this particular video, I'll be looking over the gun's striker assembly and the striker safety mechanisms. Before that, I want to give you a quick rundown of this gun's issues. Customer initially brought it in complaining about a heavy trigger pull. Now, aside from the obvious PMM compensator and SIG Pro Cut slide, this 320 is stock mechanically. Nothing has been changed aftermarket in regards to triggers or firing pins or FCU in general. I go into greater detail in the previous video, but I just want to preface that before we get into this one. So yes, I did a initial check of the pistol and I confirmed the customer's issue was legit. After doing a bit of research, I basically found that this 320 has a what we jokingly refer to as a shake awake trigger, where you could pull the trigger to a certain very hard point. The way it would stack up feels like 10 plus pounds, and it would reliably discharge if you tapped the slide or you lifted up on the slide mechanism. I couldn't find any obvious flaws or issues in the fire control unit, so the next step for me was looking into the gun striker assembly. So as a armor or gunsmith, a lot of the time you have to go through a process of elimination and finding the underlying issue, especially when it's not obvious where the root of the problem is. So yeah, we'll be examining this 320's striker, its striker safety system, and we'll be comparing it to how other contemporary pistols implement their striker safeties. And probably most interestingly, we'll also be doing a test in where I examine how the striker behaves on this gun under like harsh, some might say unrealistic testing protocols. However, I believe these tests were worth doing and sharing online. I think some of you may be surprised by the results. And to close the video out, I will share some of my own personal thoughts on SIG, the P320, and all of the recent controversy that's been stirring around. As of publishing of this video, it's been 150 days since it has ended today. Alright, so let's begin. This is the SIG Sauer P320's striker assembly. The striker assembly is made up of multiple smaller parts, of which we'll go into greater detail very soon. Now, relative to other designs, the P320 striker assembly is rather complex. Many armchair armorers and gunsmiths consider it to be sort of an Achilles heel in regards to the gun's overall design. So let's begin a deep dive of this assembly and see if some of that criticism is warranted. Alright, so to start, we have the striker assembly stripped down for the first time, and immediately we can make out two broken pieces of spring there to the right. This is, or was, the P320 striker return spring. Now, a broken spring is usually never a good thing to see, but the argument can be made that a striker return spring is redundant on a striker fire gun. Supposedly, SIG themselves removed this spring on the newest production P320s. Many other popular striker fire pistols on the market today don't make use of this spring, including the likes of Glock and Smith & Wesson. Let's move on to the next spring that we'll be taking a look at. This is the striker safety spring. Unlike the striker return spring, the striker safety spring serves a very important function in the P320 safety mechanism. Its job is to power the striker safety lock. It's a flat piece of steel that rides in the channel of the striker assembly housing. So for all intents and purposes, this is how the P320's firing pin block system works. As you can see in this demonstration, this gun's firing pin safety system seems to be working without any issues. You pull the trigger, which engages the striker safety, which engages the striker safety lock, which engages the safety lever spring, which pushes it back down and resets the mechanism. So together, the safety block and the tiny spring that powers it serve a very important purpose. They have a very important job in blocking the striker when it is not supposed to drop, i.e. without the pull of the trigger. As we go on in the video, I'll do my best to explain my issues with the P320's striker safety design, and I'll also be comparing it with other contemporary pistols and how they implement their striker safety. Alright, so after looking over the FCU and not finding anything particularly wrong, obviously my next step was to diagnose what was going on in the slide. The frame, corresponding part, of course, is the striker safety arm. It's working fine. The striker safety arm was moving up properly. It wasn't binding like I suspected it would have been. Seeing the striker arm working within the slide is very hard to get on camera, but point is, it seemed to be working fine. So without finding any obvious flaws in the lower, the FCU, and the striker assembly, the upper, I was feeling pretty stumped. However, as it turns out, during this time, a lot of YouTubers were doing technical breakdowns of the 320 and what might be going wrong with it, including three P320s in a trench coat, LFD research video. They both came out with videos that encouraged 320 owners to test the function of whether their striker safety was working as intended or not. And I'll be honest, it kind of hurts for me to admit this, but When I saw the striker safety arm working and interfacing with the striker safety spring and everything seemed to be working okay, it's like, I don't need to do this test. I mean, I'm pretty sure the striker safety is going to work, right? So yeah, I wasn't really particularly enthused to do this test, but at this point I had nothing to lose. So I put the P320 in a vise, got a pencil, and I was ready to do a sear drop test. The whole idea behind the test is to see whether the firing pin block, or striker safety lock as it's known in the 320, is doing its job properly. And its job is to stop the firing pin if and when the sear and striker were somehow able to slip away from each other without the pull of a trigger. Right now you are seeing a factory new SIG Sauer P320. This P320 is fresh out of the box. It feels like a P320 should, with the typical trigger pull and no weird glitches in the action, no shake awake of course. This will be our control gun in this experiment. We will test our problem child P320 right after. Okay, so beginning the test, we are going to start by seeing how a normal trigger pull striker safety drop looks. So with the pull of the trigger, the striker safety block is being defeated, and of course we get a full power striker hit on the pencil. Trigger is being pulled, striker safety arm is being defeated, therefore striker drops at full power as intended. Next up, we'll do our test where we press down directly on the sear. We won't be pulling the trigger at all here. In this test, we are relying on the striker safety block, firing pin block, to do its job and hopefully block all movement of the striker going forward. We shouldn't see any movement in the pencil. Despite my best efforts, pressing the sear down pretty hard sometimes. As predicted, no issues with this brand new 2025 P320. Okay, next up we'll do the same test with our problem child P320. I did take the compensator off just for this test. Again, starting with regular trigger pulls, we'll see that pencil jump. Striker is going forward all the way with solid hits on the pencil. And next up is the sear press test. So I started off with light presses of the sear. It was passing the test. The pencil was not jumping at all. That is until I experimented pressing harder on the sear. Note the movement of the pencil every time I press down. Obviously, no trigger pull here. We're just pressing down on the sear. Some apt commentary coming up.
See, in some of those, the striker was dropping hard enough to make the pencil jump pretty much the same distance as a trigger pull. Almost, you know?
Yeah, so that wasn't good. So after concluding that test, I was surprised at the results. There was nothing in the FCU or the firing pin assembly to lead me to believe that the striker safety was somehow failing and letting the striker go forward. I know one of the revisions SIG did in the quote-unquote voluntary upgrade was adding a second ledge on the sear to catch the striker if it flies forward. I have no idea whether that was doing its job or not. Maybe it was. Maybe what we saw there with the pencil getting tapped a little bit, maybe in reality that was nowhere near enough force to set a primer off. But there was only one way to find out, and that's why I wanted to set this test that you're about to see up. I took to my reloading bench and put together some primed but not loaded 9mm. In our mock test with the pencil, we knew that the striker was making contact with the pencil / primer. Question is, how hard were those impacts? Hard enough to set off a primer? Maybe the secondary sear was doing its job well enough. There was only one way to find out. We'll start things off with a function check.
So first I'm going to get a regular trigger pull. Let's see how indent on the primer looks for that. So purposeful squib here. Okay.
Not gonna lie, that was a little bit louder than expected. Now let's see how it does with a direct press of the sear. No pull of the trigger here. Will the firing pin block do its job? Will the second sear ledge do its job and prevent that primer from going off? Well, I'll spoil it for you right now and tell you, yeah, seems so. After about a dozen attempts, none of the primers were hit hard enough to detonate. The striker safety did indeed do its job, and I was relieved to see it. Pressing down on the sear like this simulates a massive failure between the striker and sear, and in this case the striker safety block of the 320 was doing its job well enough. I do want to show you how the primer hits looked. The primer hits partially blocked by the striker block, how they looked like. Quite a few attempts with just a very light dimple on there. So after this test, on one hand I was glad that the striker safety was doing its job, but on the other hand I knew I wasn't getting any closer into finding out what exactly was wrong with this gun. I was feeling stumped. No parts in particular, whether in the FCU or in the striker assembly, looked obviously faulty. With other guns, let's say like a Glock or even the 1911, You can take a look at the contact mating surfaces of those and immediately see, okay, something is wrong there, so that part is rounded out. That spring is worn out and needs to be replaced. This P320's parts look fine. So with all of that said, I think the only conclusion I can make at this time is that it's coming down to tolerance stacking. Remember the factory fresh 2025 P320 without any issues? Why did that gun pass the firing pin block test with flying colors? And sure, like I said, the pencil test is not the be all end all, but there was no movement in that pencil at all, as I recall. On the other hand, we did see movement in the pencil with our problem P320. And I'm not a trained SIG Sauer armorer when it comes to the P320, so those light striker taps might be standard operating procedure as far as I know. But why would one P320 stop that striker dead in its tracks, and you have another whose striker tip is still making contact with the primer? That's a bit weird. And personally, in a perfect world, perfect design, I would like the striker block, firing pin block, to stop the striker dead in its tracks if the striker somehow falls without the pull of a trigger. That's just me. Now, I'm definitely not the first one to talk about how tolerance snacking might negatively affect the P320. Definitely not the first one bringing this theory to the table. Every now and then you'll see comments on YouTube, totally unverified, saying these people are supposedly ex-SIG engineers and they say tolerance stacking is what's at the core of all the P320's supposed issues. And if you want this amateur armorer's opinion on it, yeah, sure, I can see it. I can see how it could be an issue. From all the safety mechanisms of the gun, how the FCU fits and interfaces with each other with the striker assembly, how consistently each component is made, especially in a modern platform that's designed from the ground up to be modular. Like the level of safeguarding to prevent against tolerance stacking in a type of gun like this would have to be next level. And I'd also like to mention, over the years I've handled a lot of P320s on the armorer's bench, on the sales counter. You pull the trigger on one, you pull the trigger on another, and you can tell there are differences between them, especially over the years. And speaking of which, let's not forget, a launch model 2014 P320 is completely different than a P320 that was made in 2020, when you would assume quality control for every gun company across the board would be at its worst. And need I not mention the infamous stealth updates SIG always seems to do with their products? I can't even imagine what the changelog would look like for the P320. I think a pistol of this design, being 100% modular, needs to be made with utmost caution and precision, especially since it was designed to be a duty-grade service pistol. The P320 isn't something like a CZ Shadow 2, where it doesn't have a firing pin block on purpose, never purports itself to be a duty pistol. A gun like that is just designed for competition and not much else. Now, I believe a duty-grade gun like the P320 should be tested hard. It should be scrutinized. On the other hand, I know there are some folks out there who see things like the SEAR press test and are like, oh, that's crazy. What does that prove? It's so unrealistic. But in my opinion, a well-engineered pistol should be able to clear tests like this that seem super unfair. It is meant to be a duty-grade service pistol, and it should be judged as such. And speaking of duty-grade service pistols, how about we do the equivalent of a SEAR drop test on the P320's direct service pistol predecessor, the Beretta 92. You might look at the two platforms, the SIG being a striker fire and the Beretta being a hammer fire. The two are, on the surface, apples and oranges. How can you compare them? But the test you're about to see, I feel, is a good analog to taking off the 320's backplate and poking down on the SEAR directly. Well, how about removing the Beretta's grip panels and yanking forward on the SEAR? First, let's see how normal trigger pulls look. Trigger is pulled, firing pin block gets lifted out of the way, and you get a solid firing pin hit. Now, I'm going to try and forcefully push forward on the SEAR, and I'm going to hope the firing pin block does its job. And as you will see, it is. The firing pin block is totally stopping forward movement of the firing pin. So after seeing that, some of you still might be thinking, oh, you can't compare the two striker fire and hammer fire platforms. Okay, let's take a look at some striker fire guns, the P320's peers, the P320's rivals, and let's see how they implement their striker and striker safety mechanisms. Spoiler alert, they're all going to be pretty similar, and they're all going to be a lot simpler than what we see with the P320. Starting out with the Glock 19X, looking extra peanut buttery here. We simply have a nub on the trigger bar, which presses up on this simple spring-loaded plunger. The plunger is made of solid steel and is powered by a simple coil spring. It doesn't get more straightforward than this. Next up, we have a Walther PDP. Walther PDP is a fully cocked striker design, just like the P320. As you can see, simple trigger bar with a big nub on it, pushes up on this slightly smaller than the Glock firing pin safety block, and only then can the striker go forward. Despite being a fully cocked striker design, the PDP has a pretty solid reputation when it comes to safety. Finally, in what might be a little bit of a plot twist, is the P320's little brother, the SIG P365. Now, interestingly, instead of a trigger bar with a nub on it, we have a little tab that rises up when the trigger is pulled. That tab interfaces with, this might look familiar, a cylindrical block of steel powered by a simple coil spring. The P365 came out a full 4 years after the P320, and many of the P320's detractors put forward the idea that the P365 is sort of a product improved P320. It is interesting to see that SIG went with a more traditional firing pin and firing pin block design on the P365 rather than keeping the P320's sort of all-in-one type design where the striker safety arm, and the spring that powers it are all housed together in one striker unit. Why SIG decided to go with this design is anybody's guess. Of course, it's common knowledge that the P320 is a striker fire retrofit of the P250, which was a hammer-fired gun. There wasn't any sort of lack of space to work with, and it couldn't be SIG just wanting to be different, could it? Unless they wanted to go out of their way and spill the beans on this, we may never know. Okay, now that we've seen how other striker fire pistols implement their striker safety / firing pin blocks, let's go back to looking at the 320s again. Personally, my biggest issue with the P320 striker safety has always been the striker safety spring. You ever take a look at something mechanical and immediately think, okay, this is different from how things usually are, and how is this gonna hold up in the long term? This is what I've always thought about the striker safety return spring on the 320. I also take into consideration SIG's stellar reputation for making torsion type springs. This is called a torsion spring, by the way. Torsion type springs that last a long time. I mean, it's not like they break constantly and break the whole gun when they do, right? Yeah, that's not the case. Okay, if you guys don't know by now, the 365 trigger return spring breaks constantly and randomly, anywhere from 200 rounds to 10,000 rounds. How much life you get from a 365 trigger return spring, it's all luck of the draw. Ask me how I know. I personally replaced like a dozen in the past year. So, if SIG is capable of producing a gun that has a spring that goes out, breaks the entire gun, vital spring on one gun, the 365, who's to say it can't happen on the P320? The 320's striker return spring is like 1/3 the size of the 365's, and the safety spring's design itself just looks fragile to begin with. Remember, this spring and the lever that it powers are our last line of defense for catching a errant striker. We can't overlook how important it is. I hate to say it, but the striker safety spring has always been suspect in my opinion. So with me being so critical about the striker safety spring, and with me testing this gun so much at this point, I wanted to do one final test. So what I wanted to find out is, let's assume that the striker safety block spring gives out. Let's pretend through normal use it breaks, it snaps into two, or we can just pretend that the armorer or SIG 320 hobbyist tuner totally forgets to put it in the first place. Now, before we get into this test, I just want to mention again and state the obvious that this particular P320 has major issues. A large majority of all other 320s out there, maybe like 99+%, will never fail in the way that you're seeing that this one is. On top of that, with removing the striker safety spring, we are absolutely setting this gun up to fail. With all that said, let's see how this nightmare scenario test will go. Man, I wish I could do a Trump impression. Look, folks, this might be the smallest spring I have ever seen, maybe ever. Again, we have a primed but empty case. Let's press down on the sear and see if any of those primers pop. Place your bets.
Testing to see how firing pin safety springless.
You'll see that the striker was still being stopped.
Okay.
That is until our third attempt.
Press hard enough without the spring.
So the striker safety arm, even without the spring powering it, was still somewhat doing its job. I'll be honest, I thought I was going to get detonation that first attempt. Let's try again.
Get my patented pokey thing. Light. Let's try a light down press. Yeah, it still went off.
Yep, as it turns out, I got it on the very next try. So if there's one thing that I can take away from doing that test, it's that the striker safety lever spring is vital when it comes to stopping the striker without a trigger pull, in this case, pressing directly down in the sear. So with that last test done, I want to wrap things up with some of my final thoughts and conclusions. Because everything on this striker assembly looks pristine, I can't even tell you what in the system is failing. And I hate to say, because it's become a cliche, and not just with the P320, but with a lot of guns on the market today, it all comes down to tolerance stacking. Certain key parts are not interfacing with other key parts as well as they should. Thus, we get issues like the striker safety block not blocking the striker 100%. We get a shake-away trigger. If any P320 armors or anybody who knows the platform better than me watches this video and sees something out of spec, obviously out of spec, please let me know with a comment below. Now, if I wanted to rectify the issues that we saw in this video regarding the striker, not even talking about what could be going on with the FCU, although no, I'm not ignoring the fact that the problems with the FCU could be compounding what we're saying the striker assembly, but basically as a start, I would opt to get a brand new SIG OEM striker assembly, and I would get the parts from it and swap them piece by piece in our problem striker assembly to find what the culprit parts are by process of elimination. Or easy mode is just getting a brand new production OEM striker assembly to replace the old one outright. We might as well do the same thing for every part in the FCU as well. Let's be real, that's exactly what SIG themselves would do to fix this issue. And I know some of you might be wondering, why are you going through all this troubleshooting? Why don't you just send it to SIG? They'll make the problem go away. But as an armorer who works at a shop who sells a lot of SIG Sauer products, I feel the need to learn more about the products that we sell, and if any of them develop issues, common issues, I want to know about them, and I want to know how to fix them. SIG themselves, despite taking so much heat, they never go into detail with what could be causing issues like this. And I know for a fact that this is not the only 320 out there with shake awake or sketchy behavior at the firing pin and firing pin block. A couple years ago, I remember a batch of 320s with weird feeling triggers like this. Who knows? That entire batch might have developed issues similar to what we're seeing with this gun. Yep, that's a bombshell. I said it before and I'll say it again. I'm not the first one to be hypothesizing this, and I'm sure SIG themselves absolutely know what is going on. They can continue to roll out stealth updates, but there are so many P320s out in the wild when everybody's doing their own configurations of them, mixing parts of different eras of the 320. You got the debut era, you got the COVID spec, and you supposedly have the best 320s ever produced in 2025, because they're really trying to boost their quality control and do thorough checks of every 320 that leaves the line. If you ask me, QC should have been sky high ever since this thing launched. I view it as the P320's Pandora's box being opened up early on. Everybody's having fun, seemed like a great platform, and then possible cracks started showing more and more often. I need not chronicle them all, and now it seems like SIG is needing to deal with consequences. I think the rest of 2025 is going to be really interesting for SIG and the 320. They're likely going to stay tight-lipped, and that's fine. From a litigious standpoint, that's probably the smartest thing they could do. I mean, if their strategy is just to think nothing is going wrong, everything is fine, you're a grifter if you think otherwise. Okay, you can think that, but hey, you're still obliged to fix this gun if I can't. I do want to mention really quick, I'm from Guam, a United States territory, small little island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. I'll say right now that getting gun service by manufacturers who don't know who we are, who don't know that we're U.S. citizens and are consumers of their products, it's not particularly easy for Guam firearm owners to get their guns serviced by the manufacturer as it is in the continental U.S. And if I'm going by the comments I see on YouTube and Reddit, it's not always easy for you guys living in the mainland U.S. either. Been reading a lot of horror stories about how rude and bad SIG customer service is for years now, but at least I would suppose most of the time they answer your emails, your phone calls, and not try to give you the runaround every time you try and get in contact with them. Alright, with all of that said, if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. My goal with these videos were to showcase the issues that this particular P320 had. You know, I know SIG fans are a passionate bunch, and they're gonna watch this and think all of it was staged, all of it was fake, like I wanted this 320 to fail, but that's not true at all. I'll say it one last time. The issues that you saw here are exceedingly rare, but the potential for them happening is non-zero. If you believe your 320 is exhibiting some of these issues, I would opt to get it checked by a armorer, or you might want to send it back to SIG for a full inspection. So in any case, again, thank you for watching. These are the first long form videos I've ever made. Very sorry for the quality, sorry for filming in vertical, and sorry for the gross audio quality and my voice. Stay safe, especially around loaded P320s. No, but seriously, stay safe, have a good one. Thank you for watching.